I'm based in Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington, New Zealand. I'm a Pākehā New Zealander and I work for HRMI as the Strategy and Communication Lead. I'm going to be leading you through some of our data today and helping you to explore how you can use it in your work. I'm joined today by Cece and Ben. Cece is behind the scenes in our Wellington office, and Ben, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Thalia. Kia ora, everyone. I'm Ben Stubbing. I'm interning for HRMI in Wellington, although at the moment I'm based in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland at the moment. Yeah, thank you very much.
So just a reminder, because I know people are joining from all over the world, we are recording this and you should feel free to change your screen name or turn your video on or off as is appropriate for you and your situation. So let me share my screen to begin. We're here today to talk about the human rights measurement data that we collect and process and publish at HRMI as we call ourselves for short. And it's me and Ben today. So a little bit about us before we begin. One important thing about the Human Rights Measurement Initiative is that we use co-design in all of our work. And by that we mean that we come to the work without knowing in advance what we're going to be doing. We want to listen and hear voices from around the human rights community and then engage to help answer the questions that have come up. So our goal is to work both with human rights practitioners and human rights and measurement academics to produce useful data for the whole human rights community. And we produce our methodologies together in a co-design way with people from all of those different parts of the human rights community. We're a diverse global team. We have bases in Wellington, New Zealand, and at 2 universities in the United States. We have people, including some of you here on the call today, who are part of the global team in about 40 countries around the world so far. We do our best to decenter the Western voices and to include all voices and perspectives. Our research is peer reviewed. It is important to us that we're producing work that's respected by the academic community as well as by practitioners. And so we can give you links to some of the journal articles that our work has appeared in. Some of our methodologies have also won awards from the academic community. So we feel confident that the scores that we're providing are robust and credible. And also feeding into that, we are independent and not-for-profit. We are independent of all governments. We are funded by donations and grants. We have an independence clause in our donations and grants. We are certainly not going to be changing our scores depending on what a government wants us to do. And we're in this because what we believe is that what gets measured gets improved. We know that leaders respect numbers, and we want to help produce numbers that the human rights community can use, useful tools to help improve people's lives. I'm now going to hand over to Ben to talk a little bit about the different rights that we measure so far. We are on a mission to measure all rights in international law for all countries, and we are just gradually expanding towards that goal. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Thalia. So in total, HRMI measures 13 rights, and they're broken into 2 different categories. So there's 5 economic and social rights, and then there's 8 civil and political rights. And you'll notice on the right there that there's different sizes in the sample for each of those. So we currently have economic and social rights for 195 countries. And we currently have data on civil and political rights for 39 countries. And that's constantly expanding as we expand our survey to include more countries. So what we measure is progressive realization, and that means that we expect, as per international law, for countries to constantly be improving in their performance of human rights. So we start with data in international databases. So this is things like UNESCO, the World Bank, the Max Planck Institute, and we combine that with a country's income to create a HRMI score, which takes a country's income into account. That is, how well are they doing at these rights given their level of income? And there are 5 economic and social rights. So these are the right to education, the right to food, the right to health, the right to housing, and the right to work. So we'll move on to social rights. Perfect, thank you. So there are 8 civil and political rights that HRMI measures at the moment. And we're the first to measure these rights in an internationally comparable way. We use an expert opinion survey, which is secure, anonymous, and online. And it includes human rights experts. And these are advocates, human rights defenders, human rights lawyers, and some journalists that specialize in human rights as well. So in total, there's around 40 countries that are included in this expert opinion survey. And next year, we're going to be expanding to include China and India. And with that expansion, the coverage of the survey will include more than half the population of the world. All right, so now I'll hand back to Talia, who's going to begin by exploring the rights tracker.
Thanks so much, Ben. So I'm hoping that you're now seeing my screen again and you're seeing the rights tracker. Great. So all of the data that we produce each year is published and freely available. It's for use by anybody under Creative Commons license. So if you want to use anything you see on the rights tracker, you can just take it. Importantly, if you have a look up here in the top right corner, the website is available in 5 languages so far. So if you are following along and one of your preferred languages is here, you may want to open it up on another screen or another device. Go to rightstracker.org and you'll be able to follow along with whichever country you're most interested in and follow along in your language. When you get to this front page, you can just put whatever right you're most interested in or whatever people group or country straight in the search bar and go to it. What I thought I'd do to start with is go to Mexico, and show you what's available. So again, if you are interested in a different country and you have another screen available, do feel free to go to rightstracker.org and pull up your country to compare as we go along. I'm going to give a little bit of a demonstration of what you can see when you're looking at the Mexico page. When you first arrive, you get the sort of headline scores, Mexico at a glance. If you do nothing else on the rights tracker, these scores can be very useful to you. We have a lot more detail, but you don't need any of it if all you want is the headline scores. So we have 3 headline scores in these boxes. For quality of life, the summary score for Mexico is 87.3%, and Ben will explain a little bit more about what that score means later on. For safety from the state, physical integrity rights, the score is 2.1, and that's on a scale from 0 to 10. And for empowerment, the overall score is 5.5 out of 10. So here you just see the rights that are in each category with their number. But we can see a lot more detail. So I'm going to take you through more detail, but I will just stress again that you could finish here if all you need is the numbers. But I'm going to take you first to safety from the state, which is our category of physical integrity rights, where we look at the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, freedom from forced disappearance, from death penalty, from extrajudicial execution, and from torture and ill treatment. And you'll see for each of those we have a score, and then we have the summary score, which is essentially an average of those 5 scores up here. And so the summary score is 2.1, and you see some bands here giving a bit of context, saying that in this band here, a score that falls there is very bad, bad, fair, and good, just to help everybody make sure that they're interpreting the scores correctly. So clearly, it will be no surprise to those of you who are in Mexico or familiar with Mexico, clearly there are significant problems there with these rights. Each of these scores is displayed within a certainty band here, as you see. And these are reasonably intuitive. Here, for the score for torture and ill treatment, for freedom from torture and ill treatment, the score is 2.6. That's the one score that that you need to quote if that's all you need. And just to understand a bit more about it, we give it in an uncertainty band. It's a little bit like a margin of error in a political poll. The true score could be anywhere between 2.2 and 3. That's what we're saying. We think it's most likely 2.6. Now you'll see that this band is quite narrow, but this band here for forced disappearance is a lot broader. It doesn't make a lot of difference in this case because they both fall into the range of very bad, sadly. But there are two factors that influence the width of the uncertainty band. One is how many respondents we have. Probably for these questions, it was the same number of respondents for Mexico, roughly. So that's probably not making the difference here. The other difference, the other factor that influences the width of the band is how divergent the respondents' answers were. And so what this is telling us is that when we asked human rights experts in Mexico what the situation was for torture and ill treatment, they all gave very similar answers. There was a high level of agreement that things were in this range. For forced disappearance, there was slightly more disagreement. There was a little bit more divergence on the scale for the answers that people gave. It's still a reasonably tight band, but that's just what accounts for the difference between them. Now you can see these scores over time if you scroll down a little. We have 5 here. If I just change the width of my screen, you're going to be able to see them a bit more easily though. So let me just move this. There you go. You'll see that over the 4 years that we've been running the survey, things have not changed dramatically. I wouldn't say that there's been a significant change in any of those. But for some countries, there certainly is over time, and it can be quite useful to correlate some of these differences with political changes, for instance. That's very clear in some countries. In Brazil, for instance, and in Hong Kong and Malaysia, in this year's data, we saw huge differences. And then if you scroll down a little further, you see for all of these safety from the state rights, you see a list of people groups who are particularly at risk of violations. So if we look at the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest, we see these are the groups that people answering our survey selected from a pre-selected list that was co-designed. And these are all the groups that they ticked as groups that are particularly at risk of violations of this right. We would say that any group that appears on this list is at risk. There may be groups that are not on this list that are also at risk, but they weren't brought to mind by our respondents at that time. So this doesn't rule anybody out, but it does record groups for which, which were identified. The larger type indicates more agreement among our respondents. And so if you hover here, you can see that for people engaged in or suspected of political violence, 63% of our human rights experts identified that group as being at risk. And if we go to, say, Indigenous people, oh, I'm sorry, my screen is a bit strange. That's 50% of the human rights experts. You can also see the people at risk lists all in one place on this tab. And this can be really useful if you are particularly interested in a people group. So here you see right to education, right to food, and it goes all the way down. All 13 rights are here. Now, this information only appears for countries that are in our survey. So there'll be other countries that are not yet in our survey where this tab won't exist. But for the ones where it does, and Mexico is one of them, you can, for instance, search for a group that you're interested in. So say Indigenous people, and that will pre-highlight all of the rights where Indigenous people have been selected as being at risk. So here you'll see they're right at the top of the list for the right to education. As you scroll down, they're also at the top for right to food. And as you just sort of scroll, you get an impression of where they're showing up or how often they're showing up. And you'll see that they're showing up in almost every list. So that's some useful information when you're following a particular group. When you're in one of these word clouds, you can do that process for any other group. So you could just highlight another group, and then that will be highlighted all the way up and down as well. So that can be quite a handy feature. As well as when we ask our survey participants who's at risk, we ask them to select from a long list of groups. Then we also give them open space to give more information. And you can see that by clicking here. Sometimes it will be some specifics about an event that happened, like a protest that was shut down or a law that's been passed. It might be about a specific people group. So rather than someone might have clicked Indigenous people and then it might specify which ethnic groups are involved. It can be all sorts of different information. This is summarized from people's responses. We don't put anything in verbatim because we're very concerned not to give away the identities of our respondents, but we sort of aggregate it together and put it into these bullet points. Now, we've been looking at safety from the state, the physical integrity rights. Just briefly, empowerment rights are displayed in exactly the same way. So empowerment rights, the rights to assembly and association, opinion and expression, and participation in government, appear in the same way. I also have these over time graphs and also have people at risk information at the bottom. One last thing I'll show you about these sets of rights before I hand over to Ben is, well, first to say that everything is clickable, and so it's worth just clicking on things whenever you want to know more about them. And also when you click here, say on the right to participate in government, we could now look at that for all countries. So because we measure this using our survey, and our survey is resource intensive to run, we're slowly expanding it around the world. This year, we were able to gather enough data on this exact right from 35 countries, and they're all listed here. They're listed here. You can sort them in all sorts of different ways. At the moment, they've got the top score at the top, but you could put them by name so that they'll be looking a little more random. The important thing to note here, we don't produce a sort of rank or index. We produce all the data and you're welcome to draw inferences from it. But when you're comparing countries, it's important to take the full uncertainty band into account. And so, for instance, if you're comparing Samoa and Taiwan and the United Kingdom, we wouldn't say that one of those is better than the other because their uncertainty bands overlap entirely. So we can't make any judgment about that. But we can say that the United States, where the upper bound of the uncertainty band is 5.1, and then we go to the United Kingdom and the bottom band is 7.1, well, we can certainly say, oh, sorry, this is Taiwan. We can certainly say that Taiwan is doing better than the United States by quite a margin. So you do just need to be a little bit careful when making comparisons. So you can get to this kind of view also by looking at the rights menu. So if you go to the rights menu, you can pick any of these rights and see how one of the survey countries compares with all the others. So this is the right to freedom from the death penalty. And the great news is that many countries in our sample do not practice the death penalty. They get an automatic 10. That's the only right that we do that for. And then we have Taiwan, which is performing here, and then a cluster of 3 countries which are all doing just as badly as each other at the bottom of the table for death penalty. So I'm now going to hand over to Ben, and while I stop sharing and he starts sharing, I'll just let you all know that we're going to take questions. We'll have plenty of time for that. Do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box if you can see one. Oh, I can't see one, so perhaps it's not there. So perhaps you just put them in the chat box. So if you have any questions along the way, Ben and I will, we might be able to answer them quickly in the chat box, or if they're going to take a little bit longer to to explain, then we will have a Q&A session when we've finished some of the presentation. So do feel free to note your questions as you go. And now, Ben, you're sharing your screen. I can see that perfectly, so I'll hand over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Thalia. All right, so now I'm going to talk about our economic and social rights or quality of life. So we're back at the home page again, and you remember there's a couple of different ways you can navigate, but I'm just going to search for a country. So let's have a look at Malaysia. So this is, again, the landing page is the at a glance, which Talia talked about, but I'm just going to come up to the ribbon and go straight to the quality of life. So once we're on this page, this is going to give you a lot more detail about the quality of life scores. And these are our economic and social rights that we measure, including education, food, health, housing, and work. It's important to note that what we're measuring here is compliance with international law. And under international law, countries have an obligation to do the best they can given their current level of income. So we're measuring how well a country is doing compared to what should be possible at its level of income. That means that to take education, for example, Malaysia is currently doing 84.5% of what should be possible, where 100% represents what should be possible. You might, to use an example, if you got 84.5% on a math test, you might be quite pleased with yourself. At my university, that's an A-, and that's pretty good. But that's not quite the case here. What we're talking about is the accomplishment of a task. It's like if I ask a flatmate of mine to do the dishes, and they report back to me that they've only done 84.5% of the dishes. I'm not going to be pleased with them because there's going to be a lot more work to be done. And also the minimum requirement of his promise to do the dishes is that he does 100% of it. And analogously, the promise that countries have made to uphold human rights, that's equivalent to doing 100% here. So the gap represents a shortfall in that regard. To help make this point clearer, just below the graph, you'll see these good, fair, bad, and very bad indicators. And the graph is also shaded slightly so that you can see those more clearly. And we'll see that the right to education is just at the top of the bad range. It's just below fair. So scrolling down a little bit further, you'll see there's some descriptive statistics that are outlined in this text. It's just a bit more information about what you've seen above. And then below that, what we can do is break down the quality of life, the right to education into smaller pieces. And we can actually look at all of the rights in this way. If you come to where it says the right to education, you can click on it and it'll open up a toggle menu where you can select another right. But if we just look at the right to education for now, you can see that it includes both the right to primary education and the right to secondary education. And it's important to note here that what these are Hermes scores. That is, this is how well a country is doing at their level of income. It's not the percentage of children that are attending school or enrolled in school. If you did want to view that though, then you can. Just here where it says Hermes scores, we can collect indicator values. And that's going to show us the underlying figures that make up our Hermes scores when combined with per capita income. So we can see that primary school enrollment is at 99.6% in Malaysia, which is very high. And so if we switch back to Hermes scores, that explains why they fall in the good category. They're doing 98.7% of what's possible at their income level. If we go back again to indicator values, we can see, however, that for secondary school enrollment, it's only at 72.2%. And that explains somewhat why their Hermes score, the score that takes account of their income, is in the very bad range. It's just 70.2%. And again, you can look at all the different rights in this way by just looking at this menu. But we'll scroll down a little bit further, and we can actually disaggregate the quality of life figures by sex as well, for a couple of different rights, not all of them. So this is the right to education by sex. And here, what's being compared is not the two genders to each other, but it's more specifically comparing how well the state is doing, how well Malaysia is doing for women compared to other countries in their economic peer group. So other countries with comparable per capita income. We can see that they're in the fair range here, just at the bottom, but they're in the bad range for men. And if we scroll down further, what we get is a view of over time trends. So we can see a slight improvement over time and then a flattening out. You'll notice in this view that the data goes up until 2018. And that's because that's the most recent data that we have available. Because as I've talked about before, our data is coming from third parties like UNESCO and the World Bank and such, and it just takes time for countries like Malaysia to collect all that data and then give it to UNESCO, and then UNESCO has to sort it to make it comparable, and then we can make our statistics. So there's a delay in getting the data. And if we scroll down a little bit further, we can see another view of the people at risk that Talia talked about before, but just focusing on economic and social rights. And again, you can get more of a view of that by going up to the ribbon, which will take you to people at risk where Talia was before. I'm just going to scroll up again. And something to notice is that if you were to click on one of these bars, like primary education, then something is going to appear on the side. And this box here will help explain the underlying indicators and where we get our information. So we go to what indicator data are used to measure this right. We'll see that this is a UNESCO score, and that's where that data is from. So if you click on anything, as Talia mentioned, you're going to get more information about where we got something or how to read it. I'll just close that now, because what I want to talk about is different ways that you can view our data. It might be that what we've talked about so far is sufficient for your purposes, but there's some more ways that you can see it as well. So at the very top of the page, there's the switch view icon, which I'm circling now. And if you click on it, again, something will appear on the right-hand side. And there's two different switches you can flip to view the data in different ways. And we're going to talk about the second one first of all. Different countries have different human rights challenges. Low and middle income countries have different challenges to high income countries. And we group indicators that we think are most appropriate to different levels of income. Now, Malaysia falls in our low and middle income category. So the scores that we've seen on the left-hand side, these are reflective of that. They're based on indicators that are most relevant for their income. But we could switch to the high income just by clicking on the high income here. And you'll notice there's a change on the left-hand side. I'll just click back so that you can see that again. And high income. The first thing to note is that some of these scores are now incomplete or there's no data available. And that's because Malaysia doesn't collect all the data that we need, or these third parties like UNESCO, they don't collect that data because it's not as relevant for a country at Malaysia's income group. If we scroll down though, when we disaggregate education into its component parts, this gives you a good illustration of how the right to education is defined and measured differently for a high income country. So whereas before we were looking at enrollment rates in primary and secondary education, here what we're looking at is the quality of education. So you'll see there's the quality of education in maths, reading, and science. And these are measured in terms of PISA scores. And you can see based on the shading, and again, these very bad, and so on and so forth categories, that Malaysia is in the very bad range for quality of life. But recalling that Malaysia is low middle income country and that they have these scores, that's to their credit that they do measure the quality of the education they're delivering. So that's one tool we can use to look at the data in different ways, is we can change the assessment standard just by switching view and going to high income. The second thing we can do is adjust the performance benchmark. And to illustrate this, I'm just going to change to a different country now. So I'm just going to click on the country tab at the top. And this time, let's do Nepal. Again, I'm going to the ribbon, going to the quality of life page, and we get the summary statistics. And just to reiterate, these scores here, they are a percentage of what is achievable at its level of income, where 100% represents the best they could do with their current resources. But what if we wanted to compare how well Nepal is doing compared to all countries in the world and the very best performing countries in the world? Well, we can do this. Again, we come to switch view just here. And this time, we're going to move from income adjusted benchmarks to global best. And when I click here, you'll notice a change in the left-hand side. I'll just go back again. And global best. And you'll see that those bars fell. You'll also notice this dotted line here. And this represents Nepal's own income adjusted score. So that means to look at the right to food, for instance. The gap between when Nepal is currently at 53% and this dotted line, that represents what it can achieve at its current level of income. It can get all the way up to the dotted line just by using its resources more efficiently. But if it wanted to get to 100% of this bar now, which is the global best, it would need to increase its level of income. So that's what the global best shows us. And if we scroll down, then you can see that the disaggregated components of each of these quality of life indicators, they're also now adjusted to global best. So those are the two different switches you can use to change the way that you view these data. All right. Something else that you might be interested in is comparing with other countries. So one way that you can do that, as Talia mentioned, was coming over to rights at the top here. And let's take the right to food again. And we're going to see here all the countries for which HRMI has relevant data on the right to food at the low and middle income range. But then Germany is at the top of the list. And you'll know that Germany is a high income country. So maybe we want to get rid of the high income countries because we're interested in Nepal and Malaysia. So we can filter this list by clicking here to add a country filter and coming down to income group. So if we just want to look at the low and middle income countries, we can select here, and that'll thin out the list a little bit more. But we can also apply a regional filter. So I've just removed that one, and I'm going to add South Asia. So here we can see Nepal compared to its region and how well it's performing. Oh, this is the global best benchmark. I'm just going to change view. This is my mistake. I forgot to switch back. So we come back to the income adjusted view. We can now see how well Nepal is doing compared to its region in terms of fulfilling their obligations to human rights in terms of what they can do with their current level of income. And similarly, we can do the same thing with Malaysia by looking at East Asia and the Pacific. Just here. All right, is there anything else, Talia, that I've forgotten to mention?
No, that's excellent. We've had lots of questions come through. So why don't you stop sharing for a minute, Ben? And Cece and I have given some brief answers to questions in the chat box, but they were quite brief. So I might just address some of them now before we move on. So we also have prepared some material on practical uses for the data, including, for instance, engaging with the United Nations, looking at sustainable development goals and other things. But let's just take a little pause and do a Q&A here. A few questions came in about the methodology, so let's just talk a little bit more about some of those details. For the civil and political rights, as we said, we measure using a survey, an expert survey methodology. Now, we do that because there aren't existing indexes that measure that put robust measurements on the human rights performance of countries. There are obviously many great groups that are monitoring and reporting on human rights violations, but what we are filling, the gap that we are filling is putting a number on the performance of human rights, the performance of countries, so that we can see progress and so that we can push for progress. We want to see the numbers going up and up. Now, we do that by going straight to the source. And so we know that for any information that is put out, say by governments on, for instance, the level of extrajudicial killings or arbitrary arrest and detention, we know that there will be underreporting, and that underreporting level will be different in different countries. So it'll be an uneven underreporting. So we simply can't compare one country to another, and we can't compare a country over time. And so when we did our first co-design workshop on this, human rights experts said, well, why don't you just ask us? It's what we call the desk drawer problem. If you work for instance, Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch or a national or local human rights monitoring organisation, there is a great deal of information that you have about the situation in your area. You publish or make public a small proportion of that information that will be constrained by budgets, by other resources, by the strategic priorities of your organisation. But in your desk drawer, you will have a lot of other files that never get published, or in your brain, let's say. So we go to you and say, well, what do you know? What do you know about what's going on in your country? And we ask you to just answer on a scale. How often is the government violating these rights? We ask you to do it on a scale. And then, because everybody who answers will have a slightly different understanding of the scale, we then ask you about a fictional country, which is the same for every person who's answering. So if you are in Mexico, we'll ask you about Mexico. And if someone else is in Australia, we ask them about Australia. And if we're going to be able to compare an answer for Mexico from one individual with an answer from Australia from a different individual, we need a sort of a control question. And so we ask about fictional countries, A, B, and C, the same countries for everybody. And we describe just in a few very brief sentences what goes on in these countries. And so for the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention, it would say something like, in country A, lots of people get arrested for their political beliefs and are never seen again. In country B, no one is ever arrested badly. And the one person who was, they went to court and it was all fine. And in country C, it'll be somewhere in the middle. So we're very obviously giving a terrible, a great, and a medium kind of performance. So we've asked you about your country, Mexico or Australia, and you give us an answer on a scale. And then we want to know what you say about the terrible country, the great country, and the medium country. And then we'll know how to interpret your answer about your country. So that is part of the quite sophisticated survey design that feeds into our then quite sophisticated statistical analysis, which for those who are interested is a Bayesian-Aldrich-McKelvey latent variable analysis. And that's how we produce the scores and the uncertainty bands. So we had some questions in the chat box about the number of respondents. Certainly, if you were going to try and find out who's going to be the next prime minister in a country and you're doing a survey of all voters, you would be aiming for 500 or 1,000 people to get your sample. But this is an expert survey. It's a quite different methodology. Rather than going onto the street and getting a representative sample, it's more like asking a panel of experts to come in to give a presentation to the Minister of Justice. And so if you think of the kinds of experts that you would invite into the office of the Minister of Justice for a meeting, it's not going to be 500 or 1,000 people, it'll be 3 people or 7 people, the people who have the most information. And so that's similar to what we do. In the literature, to use this kind of methodology, the minimum number of respondents is 3. We have raised that minimum to a level of 5 for all countries that are not of a very small population. So we take it back down to 3 for, at the moment, very small island states where there are very, very small populations, under 120,000 people. For all other countries, it's a minimum of 5. And if we don't get 5 responses for each question, we don't produce data for that question. And so you'll see for some countries that we're a little bit on the cusp. There'll be most questions we have data, but maybe someone finished the survey halfway through, and so it fell below that threshold. The average number is more like 15 or something like that. I haven't looked at the numbers this year, but it's quite a range. I think the largest group this year was 55 or something like that. I think Taiwan won the unofficial contest for the number of respondents. So it's and the number of respondents feeds into that uncertainty band as I demonstrated on the rights tracker. So we don't publish the number of respondents on the rights tracker, but we do take it into account when we're producing the numbers. I've seen more things coming through. Let me just have a quick look at what the questions are. Okay, great questions. So who are our respondents for the survey? It's obviously a very important question. So our basic methodology is to start with a trusted partner the first time that we go to a country. So we would go to someone who very obviously is an appropriate respondent, someone who is the country monitor for Amnesty International or who works for an independent national human rights institution, someone like that. And we would ask them to recommend the right people in their country. We are not the experts on who is an expert in Kazakhstan or Liberia or any other country. So we rely on local people's knowledge. Then we use a snowball methodology where then those people can also recommend others. The obvious difficulty challenge in this methodology, as someone has pointed out in the chat box, is that we need to be careful that that doesn't mean that it's just a whole lot of similar people answering. So we now have a part of the methodology where we appoint HRMI ambassadors in each survey country, and they oversee recruitment of respondents, complementary to the method that I've described already. And one of their responsibilities is to make sure that there is a range of respondents. So both in terms of who the respondents are in their own identities, so that there's a range of people giving feedback, and then also a range of expertise. So we collect information on the respondents in the survey on what their expertise is. So we would be able to see if, for instance, nobody answered the survey who was an expert in disability rights or in gender or something like that. And so far, we do have a pretty good spread in each country. So it definitely, there are risks, and so far it's working out pretty well. Now, there are more questions coming in, so give me a second to just read them. Do people do the survey from 1 year to the next? Yes, we hope they will. We have a pool of survey respondents 1 year, and there's no guarantee that they're going to do it again. We try and make the survey experience as painless as possible. It's very long. We're asking a lot of questions, and we're trying to ask them really carefully, like asking those fictional country questions. So we're certainly aware that it takes a bit of time, and it can be quite grueling to just spend an hour thinking about what's going wrong in your country. That's quite emotionally draining. But we work hard each year to try and make it a little shorter and a little easier to answer. And because the survey is entirely anonymous, we can't be sure who has answered from 1 year to the next. We don't know if it's the same group or completely different people. We know that we send it out. If you've answered 1 year, we will send you an invitation to do it the next year, but we don't know if you're going to take us up on that. The invitations that we send out, obviously someone has to know your email address to send it out to you, and so that's a very secure bespoke and well-audited security system that keeps that information, and it's only a very small number of people who have access to it. So we know that we send the invitations out to a certain number of people, and about a third of them each year will actually complete the survey, but we don't know which third. A question about, I guess, various biases. So there are a few different sort of biases that we obviously need to be careful of. Some people worry that we're just going to get a whole lot of people who care about human rights, but we're okay with that bias. We only ask people who are independent of government. So if you are working for the government, you are not eligible to participate. Again, we have a small exception for very small countries under 120,000 population, where it's very likely that there will be a bit of overlap in the population of human rights experts and government employees. But we have I can talk more about how we are careful about that later. But for most countries, no one with ties to the government can be a participant. So the people who are participating have to have a high level of human rights knowledge. So that they are a particular kind of group of people. They're certainly not the general public. There's a really good question that's just come through about how we control for the fact that in a country you might become a bit sort of used to the situation and you might not think it's so bad because it's how it's always been. Or if things have dramatically improved recently, you might think things are wonderful when actually they've just gone from terrible to okay. That's a really good question. We control for that using those fictional countries. So if, for instance, on the scale, you say, oh, my country's okay, in a country that's actually terrible, then when we describe to you a country that's terrible, you'll also say that that's okay. And then we'll know your okay is actually a terrible for the rest of us. And so we'll be able to moderate your answers in that way. So that's the way that different countries are made comparable. Really good question. Okay, I think that we will move to the next part of the presentation, and I'll be delighted to have more questions after that bit. So do keep them coming. So something that I didn't point out is that on the at a glance view, you can download a PDF version of the country profile, and that could be quite useful if you want to just send a document around or include it as a fact sheet in lobbying or things like that. So it looks like this. There's a download PDF button here, and so you just click that and it will come up, and it looks kind of like this. If you are working on a submission for the Universal Periodic Review, or if you're doing a shadow report for another treaty body or something like that, then our data can be quite useful for those things. So our data complements your findings. Obviously, your findings will be the most useful when you are doing a report on how things are in your country. You'll be able to say, if you work with on Indigenous people's rights, then you'll be giving the specific information about exactly what's going on. But then you might want to add in our data just to give a bit of context and to say, what we're finding is part of a larger trend, and it's been, also corroborated by this methodology. So we give the sort of high level context for the specific information that you're able to provide. And it also means that our data can reinforce your messages and just show that they're not coming from just one organization's views. It can show that your findings are part of a wider trend, and so therefore also to be listened to even more. And what we hear from experts in participating in particularly the UPR, using external data like HRMIs, it does actually make your submission more persuasive. Certainly in all of those treaty body processes, the data that comes from your organisation is primary, it's most important. But just adding a sentence in every section that says what the HRMI score is can help make your submission more persuasive, more likely to be included in the country summary, be more likely to influence the diplomats who will be making statements as part of the process. If you're working on the Sustainable Development Goals, then quite a few pieces of our data will be useful. All of our indicators do line up with different sustainable development indicators. And so, Cece, if I can ask you to put the link in the chat box, we have an article on SDGs that has a table that lines up all of our indicators with the SDG goals, just to really help you make it nice and easy. Remembering what we add if you're working on sustainable development goals is that our scores take income into account. And so we can help countries determine what a realistic goal is given their level of income, whether, like we saw in Nepal's scores, whether there is actually quite a lot of room for improvement even without more income, or whether, as in some countries, the income adjusted scores are very good and the country is going to need more income to make more progress. Speaking of progress, you can use the over time graphs to show progress, and for economic and social rights, those graphs have 11 years of data, and so you can see trends over time, which are obviously relevant towards reaching the SDGs. And you can use the people at risk information for countries that are in our survey to highlight things like gender inequities and impacts on vulnerable groups. Now that's for the SDGs, for the economic and social rights particularly, but it's also worth saying that, goal, sorry, I never remember if it's 16 or 17, 16 I think, is about democratic institutions. And so our civil and political rights scores are really relevant for that. And they're a really important data source for that SDG. This year in our survey, for the first time, we also included questions about the impact of COVID-19 on human rights, especially the impact of government responses to COVID-19. So this year, and we're going to do it again, I mean, as long as the pandemic is a significant part of global life, our survey now includes questions asking how the government responses to the pandemic have influenced rights enjoyment. We have a report that brings it all together. We have a lot of data that's on the rights tracker in the qualitative responses, those bullet points under people at risk. There's a lot of information about COVID there, but we've pulled it all together, including some quantitative data from those questions on a report that's available from our website. And Cece will put the link to the pandemic report in the chat box. It's pretty interesting reading. There are some clear trends. You won't be surprised to know there were huge impacts on a wide range of human rights. So that's all that I would like to share from this presentation. So I'll stop sharing and we'll come back to any questions you have. I see several more have come through, so give me a chance to read them and we'll see what else we'd like to talk about. Timing of the survey. Yes, so the survey, it's annual, and so we measure how things were in a calendar year. So we put the survey out in February of the following year, asking about the previous year. So every February and March, we'll be sending the survey out for people to answer questions about the year that's just gone. And yes, in Hong Kong, we saw in the Hong Kong scores, there was already a dramatic drop. And yes, we will not be surprised if we see more drops next year, sadly. Yeah, great comment from Johnson Young about experts, particularly in China. So China is our new challenge for the coming year. We're expanding to China and also to India. We have had some practice at collecting data in countries where governments are hostile to human rights. So Saudi Arabia has been in our sample in Vietnam since the beginning. And so we have a bit of practice at how to try and reach the right people. And we are going to engage specific staff members to help us with China, particularly because it's so big, to try and make sure that we can do this. Our respondents for Saudi Arabia are, probably because we don't know for sure, that I don't know any of their names, but I think most of our respondents for Saudi Arabia are not based in Saudi, because it's obviously dangerous to be a human rights person in that country. So it'll often be people who are monitoring the situation from exile, from safety of another country. I expect that there will be some people in that situation for China. It may be. We will take advice. We're starting sort of now to take advice on how to do this in China. It may be that we're able to securely get data from within China. And certainly we have, a very high security kind of setup to keep people as safe as possible if they choose to participate. Yes, great points. All the way. Great. Ming Foon, do the stats make a difference positively? Well, that's a great question. Our job is to provide the tools and to get them into the hands of people who can use them. And so perhaps it would be good to have a discussion now and to hear all of your ideas about how to use these data. We certainly have seen the data being used by a range of different organisations and also in the media to help people to help strengthen arguments that there need to be improvements. Yes, you can speak. If anyone would like to turn their microphone on, you're most welcome to ask a question orally. We're going to see the impact of this over time, and also some of the impact we won't be aware of because a lot of these conversations will happen privately. But we certainly hope that just as government ministers might call in experts to talk about how to raise GDP or how to get more people into jobs, we want to provide data so that it's really easy for government ministers to pull people in to say, how do we get our HRMI scores up? That's the goal, to provide the data to be useful tools in advocacy. So I see a question from Asyr. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but I see your hand up. Go for it.
That's absolutely fine. My name is Asker. Sorry, this one was a bit complicated to write out, so I thought maybe just to speak it out. So my name is Asker Kjørm. I'm working for an organization called the ICT. We work with torture victims, but I'm also a UN expert working on regulation of trade and torture tools. And so what struck me with it, I mean, first of all, thank you very much. I've had many conversations with your colleagues, and this is extremely interesting and useful. What struck me was that it might be interesting in terms of enhancing the use to try to identify much more specific data points that directly relate to existing human rights monitoring activities or mandates. So for example, what will most likely be coming up in the, and I know this is a total niche area, so it's more an example, right? But in the whole aspect of trade in torture tools, is how do you regulate tools that can be used for other things? And here, if you could actually start having more systematic and comprehensive data on states that use, for example, what's called PSM equipment, so equipment for crowd control and stuff like that, which we see in many countries in the US, but also across Latin America and so on, where they misuse this equipment systematically for torture and ill treatment. If one could actually have data on that, it would be much easier to regulate and argue that there should be export bans on those countries. So that's an example, but in my other job, we work quite a lot on actually trying to identify these kind of specific points where we can collect data so that it plays directly into monitoring activities. But thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So I guess what we're trying to do is give a really high level measurement of how well a state is meeting its obligations, and providing space in the survey for people to give really specific examples of what's going wrong. And so, so what I would hope is that if you are a person who has knowledge of what's going on in that really specific scenario about trade in tools of torture, that you would mention that in the qualitative information, and that it would make it onto the rights tracker in that form. What we hope to do is to expand over time to measure all rights in international law. So at the moment, we've started with a collection of high-level civil and political rights and economic and social rights. We want to move on to, for instance, the Disability Convention, the CEDAW, the rights of the child, and for instance, we might want to develop. There might be an appetite to develop a CAT. Specialist survey or other methodology, where we look at all of the things about torture that people want to measure, and so that would probably be the way forward, is if there was appetite among people working on torture to have other things measured, then just we want to know about that, and then we could go through the process that we've gone through for these two existing methodologies. We have a co-design workshop with a whole lot of practitioners and experts. We find out what are the things under the convention that you want to have measured that are not being measured. How should we best measure them? And then we go from there. So we're very interested in expanding to do all of those things. And the next one that gets done will just be about who comes along and is able to staff and fund it. So anytime you come across someone who says, this is the thing that I really want scores for, and I know a foundation that would fund that, then please talk to us. Other questions? How the definitions, yeah. So I mean, we're going on definitions of under international law. We use the general comments and the treaties. Yes, obviously, it does get complicated. And with CRPD, with CEDAW, we would start with a co-design workshop, and we would work together to find out how we're going to do it. So as I say, we don't come in with the answers. We don't come in with an agenda. We come in as people who can help to do the measuring. But we need to work with those of you who are experts on CRPD or CEDAW to find out what it is that you want to have measured and how it should be done. Do we work with treaty monitoring bodies? We work with anybody. So there will be people on treaty monitoring bodies who are respondents, probably. I mean, I don't know because they're anonymous. I hope there are. And we've been asked to brief some treaty monitoring bodies about our work, and I hope there will be more of that. If you're involved with one, please send us an invitation. We will do a workshop for anybody who wants one. And if you have, if you're working for an organisation and you wish some of your colleagues were here today, or if you want to talk only about freedom of expression or whatever right that you're most interested in, then please just let me know. I'll put my or actually Cece, if you wouldn't mind just putting my email address in the chat box again. We're really happy to arrange a workshop for you and your colleagues, or for any interested group, and we could go into really specific details on whatever it is that you're most interested in. Can I suggest that any more questions, you take your microphone off mute and just speak them out.
Talia and Angeline had a question in the chat just about clarifying, quote, just to clarify that the best possible standard for each country is the ideal situation where they do fulfill an international human rights standard, regardless of whether they currently ratify treaties. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah. So we are measuring whether the country would meet the standard if they had ratified it. So for some countries, obviously there are gaps. Yeah. So we are measuring regardless of ratification status. Obviously, the lobbying that you would do in a country would depend a little on the legal situation. Vicky, are you asking me to get in touch with those email addresses? Brilliant. I'll take a copy of that.
If nobody else wants to say anything, I did have a comment from my normal paid job. I think one thing, so we work with organizations that provide rehabilitation to torture victims in 75 different countries. And I think that there are two things that have really struck me that I'm interested in whether you see that as well. So the one is that almost no matter how many people we ask, we get extremely biased responses in terms of the affected groups and the at-risk groups. So often they are based on common conceptions about who gets tortured. For example, if you ask people in Uganda, they will say, oh, it's political activists and protesters, but actually the vast majority are just poor people and refugees, right? It often people who are subjected to either sexual and gender-based violence, different discrimination-based practices are totally non-existent in the minds of the mainstream anti-torture activists. So that's something that at least we really like, even if we span quite broadly within the experts there, that's really, really difficult. And the other thing is, but I wrote that, but I maybe wasn't so clear. Like we also experienced that within a country, there can be these strong collective perceptions. For example, in many countries in Latin America, where you maybe don't have massive torture problems anymore, there's still this perception that torture is extremely problematic because they still relate to what happened during the dictatorships. So that wouldn't necessarily show in your, because if the whole collective understanding of what's going on is actually not really but especially the first one, I think is extremely important to think about and how we can all be better at that.
Yeah, so agreed. I would say on the first one, so for both of them, we ask a very specific question in the survey. We say, so the survey this year said, in 2020, how many people did the government subject to torture and ill treatment? Or it's along those lines. And is it a lot of people or not many people? And then we say, and of the people, who was most likely to be a victim of violation? And I would say that the lists are usually quite long. So those word clouds that we saw. So I suspect Uganda isn't in our survey, but if you go to another country that you're familiar with and that you're familiar with this problem that you describe, I'd be really interested what you see reflected, whether you see the reality coming through as well as the popular perception. And then when it comes to historical kind of hangovers of feeling like there's this big problem, even if it's got better. Again, we ask very specifically in 2020, what did happen? So, I mean, that's the best we can do. If people don't want to answer that question accurately, then they don't. But it's also true that that we check people's, I guess, accuracy and their understanding of human rights with those fictional country questions, because as well as giving us their scale, we know whether to stretch it or move it. It's also a little bit of a test. So if people get them the wrong way around, and they say that the terrible country is better than the medium country, then we will assume that they haven't been paying attention, and their answer will not count for that page. So it's it's one way of just making sure that that we're getting reasonable quality answers. Now, I think we'll draw the session to a close and stop recording, but I will stay around for another 20 minutes for any further conversations or questions. And Cece, I assume you're taking a copy of these email addresses from the chat box. Brilliant. Very pleased